Hey, friends. You know, have you ever really wondered what a record producer does? It is kind of confusing. I mean, it isn't really analogous to a movie director. A movie director's role is pretty clear cut. The movie director is directing the film, directing the actors, telling the cinematographer where to put the camera, telling the lighting person how to light the scene, coaching the actors. That's kind of what movie directors do. But record producer's role isn't clear cut at all. It depends entirely on the relationship and, well, the style of the producer, and then the relationship between the producer and the artist or the band. So, I think one of the best stories I ever heard about how this works was told by Billy Joel. And Billy Joel had made a few records that didn't really go anyplace. And then he hooked up with this guy named Phil Ramone. Phil Ramone was a big deal. He had produced Paul Simon and a lot of people, and he made a lot of great records. But he's producing what turned out to be Billy Joel's The Stranger album. Billy Joel shows up at the session with his band, and Phil Ramone, they say their hellos, and then Phil Ramone says to the band, why don't you run down some of the tunes? So they play the tunes, and then Phil Ramone says to the bass player guy, I like what you're doing. It's really good. But, I think if you did this, maybe held that note a little longer. Okay, drummer guy, I like what you're doing, but I think you got to use more tom-toms. You got to open this up a little bit more. Give it some more space. I'm just making up the thing. But he tells each of the musicians how to tweak what they're doing, right? And Billy Joel said, and then I understood what a record producer could do for me. Because they all knew the tunes before they got into the studio. But with with his guidance, he tweaked it and made it just more better. He made the song better. Better than Billy, who was super talented, but better than Billy could do on his own. And it was true. He made a great record. It was a huge record, sold gazillions of records. Just as talented before he met Phil Ramone. But he needed Phil Ramone to tweak it. That's what production was. That's like one of the most concise examples of how it works. I mean, a lot of times it's way more subtle. This recording engineer, Walter Sear, who's a great engineer, great guy, who's no longer with us, he told me a great story. He said that he was watching Arif Martin produce Norah Jones' Come Away With Me album. And he said, Arif Martin would just sit in the control room and do crossword puzzles and essentially looked like he wasn't doing anything. But then the band would come in to listen to a playback, and he'd still be working on his crossword puzzle, and he would just look up every now and then at a certain part of the song and say, Norah, I think if he would just nudge her a little here, a little there. And then, bingo! Norah Jones has Come Away With Me. It sold like 15 million copies. Just as talented before she ever worked with Arif Martin, but Arif just knew exactly where it needed some tweaking. A little adjusting here, a little adjusting there, bingo. Then there are really very heavy hands-on producers like Phil Spector from the 60s. I mean, he made records with girl groups and stuff and River Deep Mountain High and everything. He had the big, massive sound. His records were really about him. The artists were incidental to his records. He made the records. He made hit records. And it was about his production. His records with the Ronettes, nobody knew who the Ronettes were, even practically. But a Phil Spector record had a sound, and people bought that sound. He was the star, not the performer. So it comes in all flavors. So I asked once Don Was. Now I met Don Was. I heard Don Was when he was a musician. He had a band called Was Not Was. They were kind of a funk band in the 70s and 80s. And he eventually drifted into or became a record producer. And he made some huge records. He made Bonnie Raitt's two biggest records, Nick of Time and that other one that followed it. And he's produced the Rolling Stones, and he produced Lucinda Williams, he produced Bob Dylan. He's a big shot producer. And he gave me a great observation about record producing and the art of making records. And he said, If the artist doesn't bleed a little, suffer through the session because they're putting so much into making their music great, it's probably not going to be a good record. But that's almost a cliche, but I love the way he capped it off. He said, if the artist doesn't call me at 3 o'clock in the morning and wake me up and say, is this a total piece of crap? If they don't do that in some fashion, it's probably not a very good record. They're not really pouring their heart and soul into making a great record. I thought that was a great line. I'm a big fan of Loudon Wainwright, and I've interviewed him a bunch of times at various things. And he once told me he made a record with Richard Thompson, who's most famous as a guitar player, and Richard Thompson was producing him. And Loudon felt that the production on his records, the band, because Loudon's really more of a solo artist. He performs mostly alone with a guitar on stage. He doesn't usually have a band. So when he records with bands, he feels like the band is kind of pushing him, getting in the way. And Richard Thompson said, no. I'm going to let the song, these songs we're going to do, it's about the song. I'm going to give space to the song. The song and you are the thing. You're in the front, the band is back there, and they're just there to support you. They're not the stars. It's the songs that are the stars on a Loudon Wainwright record. And it gave Loudon some confidence, to do this. Now, I've had a long association with David Chesky, and I've been present at dozens, probably 50 Chesky sessions. And David Chesky's producing style is in that laid-back kind of category. He doesn't really tell the band what to do. He might say, pick it up a little bit, or bass player's out of tune or something. But his production, he's really producing sound. Chesky records have a sound. And when he's producing, his utmost concern is making them sound his way, the way a Chesky record sounds. He's a super talented musician and a great composer and a great artist in his own right, so he knows the music from the music side. But he basically wants the musicians to do it the way they want to do it. He'll nudge, he'll tuck a little here and everything, but he's pretty much hands-off when it comes to the musical parts of making a Chesky record. That's the band's domain, let's say. So I've given you a bunch of examples, and it's just to say there really isn't a hard and fast way. I mean, in Jeff Emmerich's book, the Beatles recording engineer for a long time, he revealed that I knew something I didn't know about. George Martin, their producer's thing was he was helping them. He was really guiding them. And Beatles would not have gone nearly as far if they didn't have a producer as amazing and as knowledgeable as George Martin. He didn't do much in the early days of the Beatles records because they were just playing like they would play live. There wasn't a lot. They were just capturing essentially their kind of live performance in a studio. But by the time they get to, Rubber Soul and Revolver, and there's more production and more sound things going on, George Martin really was amazing. And, he was a classical composer, engineer and producer. He knew that music. He is super deep guy when it comes to music, and he could help, John and Paul counterpoint and tweak them. And Jeff Emmerich revealed in the book that sometimes after the Beatles went home, George Martin would go in and fix parts, like on a keyboard part that, let's say, John played, and John was kind of clumsy on the piano. George Martin would just go in and re-record that part and play the part himself. So he was literally hands-on on some of those early Beatles records. Now, of course, by the time the Beatles get to Sgt. Pepper, they're super famous and super powerful, and their power relationship had changed, because where before George Martin was kind of their boss, now the Beatles were George Martin's boss, and he was there to serve them. He wasn't no longer really in control. So again, these relationships between producer and artists are not locked to any real thing. Again, it's the artist and it's the producer and how they do this dance together to make a record. So, I hope that helps your understanding of what exactly it is a record producer does. My name is Steve Guttenberg. I am the Audiophiliac. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show. Comes up daily. Share it, like it, do all that social media stuff that the kids are into. And if you really, really, really like these things that I do, I would urge you to check out my Patreon page. And you can find it at www.patreon, that's patreon.com/audiophiliac. And see what you see there, and maybe you could kick in $1 or $2 a month to keep this commercial free. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you real soon.